6,000 people packed into one of America's most legendary venues for what was supposed to be Whitney Houston's triumphant return to live performance after months away from the stage. The sold-out crowd had no idea they were about to witness something that would go down in music history, not because of Whitney's perfect vocals or flawless choreography, but because of what she couldn't do that night. Whitney Houston walked onto that stage knowing she was about to perform the most important concert of her career while being almost completely deaf in both ears. A severe ear infection had robbed her of the one thing she relied on most as a performer, her ability to hear herself sing. But what happened when she opened her mouth to sing, "I Will Always Love You," in front of 6,000 people she couldn't hear would prove that true artistry lives not in the ears, but in the soul. The infection had started 3 weeks earlier during the final days of recording sessions for her upcoming album. Whitney had been pushing herself beyond human limits, working 18-hour days in the studio, while dealing with the emotional devastation of her deteriorating marriage to Bobby Brown. The combination of stress, exhaustion, and her increasingly serious cocaine habit had weakened her immune system to the point where even a minor cold could turn into something dangerous. When the pain in her right ear started, Whitney ignored it. She had ignored so many warning signs from her body over the past 2 years that one more seemed insignificant. The constant pressure to maintain her image as the voice, to be perfect in every performance, to never show weakness had created a pattern of denial that was slowly destroying her from the inside. By the time she finally saw a doctor, the infection had spread to both ears, causing severe inflammation of her inner ear canals and temporary but significant hearing loss. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the ear, nose, and throat specialist who examined Whitney, was horrified by what she found. The infection was so severe that Whitney's eardrums were bulging with fluid, and her ability to hear high-frequency sounds was reduced by nearly 70%. In medical terms, she was experiencing what's called conductive hearing loss, where sound waves couldn't properly reach her inner ear. I told her in the clearest possible terms that she needed to cancel any upcoming performances and rest completely, Dr. Mitchell later revealed in a 2010 interview. Her response was to ask me if there was any way she could perform one more show. Just one. I said absolutely not, that attempting to sing with this kind of ear damage could cause permanent hearing loss. She thanked me for my time and left my office. I knew she was going to do it anyway. The Radio City Music Hall concert had been scheduled for months as a special benefit performance for the Children's Defense Fund, an organization that provided support for at-risk youth. Whitney had a personal connection to this cause, having grown up in Newark watching her mother Sissy work tirelessly to help children in their community escape poverty and violence. Canceling this show felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in, but more than that, it felt like admitting defeat to the demons that were already winning too many battles in her private life. The cocaine use that had started as an occasional indulgence at parties had evolved into a daily necessity. Whitney had convinced herself that she needed it to perform, to maintain her energy, to be the Whitney Houston everyone expected. But the truth was that the drugs were destroying her health, her relationships, and now potentially her hearing, the very foundation of her talent. Backstage at Radio City Music Hall 3 hours before showtime, Whitney's team was in crisis mode. Her longtime vocal coach, Gary Katona, had been brought in to assess whether Whitney could physically perform. After running through a few scales with her, his verdict was devastating. "Whitney, you can't hear yourself," he told her bluntly. "You're singing sharp on the high notes because you're compensating for what you think you should be hearing. If you go out there tonight, you're going to embarrass yourself in front of 6,000 people and everyone watching the broadcast." The concert was being filmed for a television special that would air nationally in 2 weeks. A bad performance wouldn't just be witnessed by the live audience. It would be permanently recorded and broadcast to millions of viewers. Whitney's manager, Robin Crawford, who was also her closest confidant and the person who knew her better than anyone, tried a different approach. "You don't have to prove anything tonight," Robin said softly, taking Whitney's hands in hers. "Everyone will understand if you cancel. Your health is more important than any performance." But Whitney had spent her entire life proving herself, proving to her mother that she could be as great a singer as Sissy had been, proving to the music industry that a black woman could cross over into pop without losing her soul, proving to the world that she deserved every accolade, every record sale, every moment of adoration. The idea of walking away from this stage felt like admitting she wasn't strong enough, wasn't talented enough, wasn't worthy enough. "I'm going to perform," Whitney said quietly but firmly. "But I need everyone to understand something. I can barely hear anything right now. My ears are so blocked that the only way I'll know if I'm singing the right notes is by feeling the vibrations in my chest and trusting my muscle memory." Her band members exchanged worried glances. Ricky Minor, her musical director, understood immediately what Whitney was proposing. She was going to attempt to perform an entire concert using only her internal sense of pitch, the physical sensation of sound waves traveling through her body, and 20 years of vocal training that had become instinctive. "That's impossible," Ricky said, not unkindly, but as a statement of fact. "Even the greatest singers in the world can't perform without being able to hear themselves. Your voice is too powerful, too complex. Without auditory feedback, you won't be able to control your dynamics, your pitch, your timing." Whitney looked at her longtime collaborator with eyes that showed both determination and fear. "Then I guess we're about to find out if I'm really as good as everyone says I am, or if I've just been lucky all these years." She turned to her entire team, the musicians who had supported her through countless performances, the backup singers who had harmonized with her voice for over a decade, the crew members who had witnessed both her triumphs and her struggles. "I need you all to trust me tonight. I know this seems crazy. I know I'm risking everything. But I also know that if I walk away from this stage without even trying, I'll never forgive myself. Those kids out there in the audience, the ones this benefit is for, they don't get to walk away when things get hard. They have to find a way to survive even when everything seems impossible. Tonight, I need to show them and maybe remind myself that sometimes you have to perform even when you can't hear the applause." When Whitney Houston walked onto the Radio City Music Hall stage that November night, she stepped into what felt like a soundproof chamber. The roar of 6,000 fans greeting her arrival reached her ears as nothing more than a muffled rumble, like distant thunder or waves crashing on a faraway shore. The elaborate stage lighting that usually energized her felt harsh and disorienting without the accompanying soundtrack of screaming fans and pumping music. For the first time in her 20-year career, Whitney felt genuinely alone on stage despite being surrounded by her band, backup singers, and thousands of adoring fans. The silence inside her head was terrifying, a void where there should have been the rich tapestry of sound that guided every performance. Without her hearing, Whitney had to rely on visual cues she had never paid attention to before. She watched Ricky Minor's hands conducting the band, counting beats and watching for his signal to begin singing. She felt the vibrations of the bass guitar through the stage floor, using those pulses to establish the rhythm. She looked into the faces of her backup singers, reading their lips to know which words came next in songs she had performed hundreds of times, but that now felt unfamiliar and strange. The opening number was Greatest Love of All, a song Whitney had chosen specifically, because its slower tempo and familiar melody would give her the best chance of maintaining pitch without being able to hear herself. As she began to sing, something extraordinary happened. The years of vocal training, the thousands of performances, the muscle memory developed through decades of practice all combined to guide her voice. Whitney couldn't hear whether she was singing in tune, but she could feel the vibrations in her chest cavity, the way her throat muscles moved, the sensation of breath support engaging her diaphragm. These physical sensations became her only reference points, replacing the auditory feedback that every singer depends on. The audience had no idea what was happening. To them, Whitney Houston was performing with her usual power and precision. But those closest to the stage, the producers in the television control booth, the musicians on stage with her, they could tell something was different. Whitney was singing with her eyes closed more than usual, her hand pressed against her chest as if physically holding onto the notes. Between songs, she wasn't interacting with the crowd with her typical warmth and humor. Instead, she was intensely focused, almost meditative in her concentration. Midway through the concert, during a particularly challenging run in I'm Every Woman, Whitney hit a note that felt wrong. She couldn't hear that it was sharp, but she could feel that the vibration in her chest didn't match the physical memory of how that note should feel. Panic flashed across her face for just a moment, invisible to most of the audience but obvious to those who knew her well. Robin Crawford, watching from the wings, felt her heart sink. She knew Whitney well enough to recognize that micro-expression of fear and self-doubt. For Whitney, That one wrong note represented everything she was terrified of. The possibility that her talent was failing her, that the drugs and the stress and the pain were finally winning, that she was losing the one thing that had always been reliable even when everything else in her life was falling apart. But something remarkable happened in that moment of panic. Instead of spiraling into anxiety, Whitney made a choice. She opened her eyes, looked directly into the faces of the people in the front rows, and remembered why she was really there. This wasn't about delivering a perfect performance or maintaining her reputation as the voice. This was about showing up for people who needed to see that you could face impossible challenges and still find a way to sing. The children this benefit was supporting didn't have the luxury of perfect conditions or second chances. They had to find strength in situations that seemed hopeless, and tonight, Whitney was going to model that resilience for them. She continued the song, adjusting her technique based on physical sensation alone, and finished the number with her characteristic power. The audience erupted in applause that Whitney experienced as a vibration through the stage floor rather than a sound, and she smiled genuinely for the first time that evening. As the concert progressed toward its emotional climax, everyone in Whitney's team knew what was coming, the moment that would either cement this performance as a triumph or expose it as a catastrophic mistake. I Will Always Love You was scheduled as the encore, the song that had defined Whitney's career and set an impossible standard for vocal perfection. This wasn't just any song. It was the song, the one that showcased everything that made Whitney Houston exceptional. The controlled power of the opening a cappella line, the gradual build through the verses, and then the explosive climax where she held that legendary high note that seemed to defy the laws of human vocal capability. Attempting this song while essentially deaf was either incredibly brave or professionally suicidal, and no one, not even Whitney herself, was entirely sure which it would prove to be. Ricky Minor approached Whitney during the break before the encore. "We can change the set list," he offered quietly. "End with something simpler, something less risky." Whitney shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "If I'm going to fail tonight, I'm going to fail doing the thing I love most. And if I succeed, I want it to be because I didn't take the easy way out." She took a long drink of water, then added something that would later be recounted by everyone present as the moment they truly understood Whitney's courage. "You know what the hardest part of this whole night has been? It's not the singing without hearing. It's the not knowing if what I'm creating is touching anyone. I can't hear if people are crying or cheering or sitting there bored. I have to trust that the emotion I'm putting into these songs is reaching them even if I can't witness it. That's terrifying in a way that goes beyond music. It's like loving someone without knowing if they love you back." The lights dimmed. 6,000 people fell into an expectant silence that Whitney couldn't hear, but could somehow feel as a change in the air pressure around her. She walked to center stage alone. No band, no backup singers, just her and the microphone and the opening a cappella line that millions of people around the world could sing from memory. This was the most vulnerable moment in her entire repertoire, her voice completely exposed with no instrumental support to hide behind or provide pitch reference. With her severe hearing loss, Whitney would have to sing this opening phrase based purely on muscle memory and faith. She closed her eyes, placed her hand over her heart, and began to sing. "If I should stay, I would only be in your way." The words emerged from somewhere deep inside her, guided by a sense of pitch that transcended physical hearing. She couldn't hear her own voice, but she could feel it resonating in her chest cavity, vibrating through her bones, existing as a physical presence rather than an auditory experience. In the audience, people began to realize something extraordinary was happening. There was a rawness to Whitney's delivery that night that was different from any previous performance of this song. She wasn't singing to prove her technical prowess or to show off her range. She was singing from a place of pure emotional necessity, each word carrying the weight of every struggle she was facing: the failing marriage, the addiction, the physical pain, the fear of losing everything she had worked for. The television cameras captured something that would become iconic in later years when the full story emerged. Whitney's face showed an intensity of concentration mixed with vulnerability that had never been visible in her more polished performances. Her hand remained pressed against her chest throughout the song, using that physical contact to feel the vibrations that were her only guide. When she reached the climactic high note, the one that had made this song legendary, Whitney had no idea if she was singing it correctly. She couldn't hear whether she had hit the pitch or whether she was embarrassingly off-key in front of 6,000 people and television cameras that would broadcast any failure to millions. All she could do was trust her training, trust her instinct, and trust that the emotion behind the note would carry it even if the technical execution faltered. Whitney held that note for what felt like an eternity, pouring every ounce of strength and vulnerability into a sound she couldn't hear. When she finally released it and opened her eyes, she saw something that confused her at first. The entire audience was on their feet, their mouths open in what she assumed was screaming or cheering, their hands raised above their heads in applause. But to Whitney, it was all happening in complete silence. She couldn't hear a single clap, not one voice, not the thunderous standing ovation that was shaking the historic venue. All she could perceive was a strange vibration through the stage floor, a physical sensation that told her something significant was happening, but gave her no indication of whether it was positive or negative. The confusion on her face was visible to everyone. Whitney stood center stage, looking at 6,000 people giving her what would later be described as one of the most emotional standing ovations in Radio City Music Hall's history. And she had no idea if they were cheering or if something had gone terribly wrong. Ricky Minor, watching from the side of the stage, saw Whitney's confusion and made a quick decision. He ran onto the stage, something he had never done during a performance before, and went directly to Whitney. The television cameras captured this moment in close-up as Ricky gently took Whitney's hand and placed it against his chest. He was laughing and crying simultaneously, and he mouthed words slowly so she could read his lips. "They're giving you a standing ovation. It's the most incredible thing I've ever seen. You did it, Whitney. You really did it." The realization hit Whitney like a physical force. These people weren't just clapping politely or showing appreciation. They were on their feet, many of them with tears streaming down their faces, responding to something profound they had witnessed. She had performed an entire concert, including the most challenging song in her repertoire, without being able to hear a single note, and somehow it had connected with them more deeply than many of her technically perfect performances. What happened next would become the defining moment of the evening. Whitney walked to the front of the stage and gestured for the audience to quiet down, a request they couldn't initially honor because the ovation was so overwhelming. When they finally settled enough for her to speak, Whitney made a decision that shocked everyone, including her management team. She was going to tell them the truth. "I need to share something with you," Whitney began, her voice carrying the emotional exhaustion of the past 2 hours. "What you just witnessed tonight was me performing an entire concert while being almost completely deaf from a severe ear infection." The audience gasped audibly, a sound Whitney could barely perceive but could see in their shocked expressions. "I couldn't hear the music. I couldn't hear my own voice. I couldn't hear any of you. I've been performing for the last 2 hours based purely on muscle memory and faith. And I'm standing here right now having no idea if what I just did was beautiful or terrible, because I couldn't hear it." The vulnerability in Whitney's confession created a moment of profound connection between artist and audience. Here was the most gifted vocalist of her generation admitting that she had spent the entire evening essentially performing blind, trusting in skills she couldn't verify, and an audience she couldn't hear. "The only reason I didn't cancel this show," Whitney continued, "is because I thought about the kids we're here to support tonight. They don't get to cancel their lives when things get hard. They have to show up and find a way to survive even when everything seems impossible. I figured if they can do that every single day, I could do it for one night." She paused, gathering her courage to say the thing she had never admitted publicly before. "But I also have to be honest about something else. This ear infection got this bad because I haven't been taking care of myself. I've been pushing my body beyond its limits, making choices that I knew were hurting me, hiding pain and struggles behind the image of perfection everyone expects." The admission hung in the air like a sacred confession. Whitney wasn't explicitly mentioning the drug use or the troubled marriage or the mental health struggles, but everyone in that audience understood she was speaking about something deeper than an ear infection. She was talking about the cost of being Whitney Houston, the price of perfection, the impossible standard she had been trying to maintain for so long that it was literally destroying her health. Tonight, performing without being able to hear, it forced me to do something I should have done a long time ago. It forced me to trust in something beyond technical perfection. I had to trust that if I sang from my heart, from a place of genuine emotion and vulnerability, it would reach you even if it wasn't perfect. And now you're telling me, with this standing ovation I can't even hear, that maybe vulnerability is more powerful than perfection. The audience's response was immediate and overwhelming. The standing ovation renewed with even more intensity, and now people were shouting encouragement that Whitney couldn't hear but could see in their faces. "We love you, Whitney. You're amazing. Thank you for being real." The television cameras panned across the crowd, capturing faces of every age and background united in their emotional response to Whitney's honesty. This wasn't just appreciation for a good performance. This was a collective recognition of the courage it takes to show up and perform when everything inside you is breaking. In the weeks following that Radio City Music Hall concert, the story of Whitney's silent performance spread throughout the music industry and eventually to the general public. The television special, when it aired 2 weeks later, became one of the highest-rated music programs of the year, not because of Whitney's technical perfection, but because viewers could see and feel the raw vulnerability she had displayed that night. The medical consequences of Whitney's decision to perform were severe and immediate. Dr. Mitchell's warning had been accurate. The strain of singing at full power with such a serious ear infection caused additional damage to Whitney's inner ear. For 3 months following the concert, Whitney experienced recurring vertigo, partial hearing loss, and constant ringing in her ears, a condition called tinnitus that would plague her for the rest of her life. The physical price she paid for that one performance was steep and permanent. But something else happened in the aftermath of that night that nobody, least of all Whitney herself, had anticipated. Her honesty about struggling, about pushing through despite being broken, about choosing vulnerability over perfection, resonated with millions of people in ways her perfect performances never had. Letters poured into her management office from fans, sharing their own stories of performing despite illness, working despite depression, showing up despite feeling inadequate. Whitney had inadvertently created a moment of collective healing by admitting she was human. The impact on Whitney's artistic approach was equally profound. In the years immediately following the Radio City Music Hall concert, she began to embrace imperfection in her performances in ways she never had before. She would occasionally sing songs in different keys than recorded, adjusting to how her voice felt that day rather than forcing it to meet some external standard. She incorporated more spoken word segments into her concerts, sharing personal stories and connecting with audiences through vulnerability rather than just vocal prowess. Some critics complained that Whitney Houston was no longer the technically flawless vocalist she had been in her early career, but those who truly understood music recognized that she had evolved into something more valuable, a genuine artist willing to reveal her humanity. The benefit concert itself raised over $3 million for the Children's Defense Fund, far exceeding initial projections. But the organization's director, Marian Wright Edelman, later said the real value of that night went beyond money. Whitney showed those kids that strength doesn't mean pretending everything is fine. It means showing up even when you're broken and trusting that your brokenness might be exactly what someone else needs to see. For Whitney personally, the concert became a reference point she returned to during her darkest struggles in the years that followed. When the drug addiction worsened, when the marriage to Bobby Brown became increasingly volatile and destructive, when the industry began to question whether she could still perform at an elite level, Whitney would remember the night she sang without hearing and somehow connected more deeply with an audience than she ever had before. It became evidence that there was something in her worth saving, something beyond technical ability or commercial success that had value. Friends close to Whitney reported that she kept a videotape of the Radio City Music Hall performance in her bedroom and would watch it when she felt most hopeless. She would watch herself performing in that vulnerable state, Robin Crawford later revealed, and I think it reminded her that she was capable of courage, that she had survived impossible challenges before and could do it again. The story of Whitney Houston's silent performance became legendary in music circles, often shared by vocal coaches and music historians as an example of the difference between technical skill and true artistry. The incident was referenced in documentaries about Whitney's life, in articles about performance under extreme conditions, and in discussions about the pressures faced by Black female artists in the music industry. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of that night was how it redefined what audiences wanted from their musical icons. The overwhelming positive response to Whitney's vulnerability and honesty signaled a shift in public appetite from superhuman perfection to authentic humanity. In the years since that November night in 1994, countless artists have cited Whitney's Radio City Music Hall performance as inspiration to be more honest about their own struggles. The willingness to show up despite being broken, to perform despite being unable to hear, to trust in emotional truth over technical perfection became a new standard for what artistic courage could look like. For the 6,000 people who were physically present that night, many reported that it remained the most moving concert experience of their lives, not despite Whitney's inability to hear, but because of it. They had witnessed something rare and sacred, a moment when the barrier between performer and audience dissolved completely. Sarah Henderson, a social worker who had brought a group of at-risk teenagers to the benefit concert, later wrote about the impact on the young people in her care. Those kids had every reason to believe the world didn't care about them. They were used to being let down by adults, by systems, by promises. But watching Whitney Houston choose to show up and perform despite being in pain, despite being scared, despite not being able to hear them cheering for her, it changed something in them. Several of those teenagers told me later that if Whitney could push through when everything seemed impossible, maybe they could too. 3 of them went on to graduate from college, something that had seemed impossible before that night. The medical community also took note of Whitney's performance, with several audiologists and ear, nose, and throat specialists studying how she had managed to maintain pitch and rhythm without auditory feedback. Dr. Mitchell, who had treated Whitney and warned her against performing, published a paper about the incident that explored the relationship between proprioception, the body's sense of position and movement, and musical performance. What Whitney Houston demonstrated that night, Dr. Mitchell wrote, was that the human voice is not just an auditory instrument but a physical one. Singers develop a kinesthetic memory of how correct pitch feels in their body, and with sufficient training and experience, they can access this physical memory even when auditory feedback is unavailable. While I still cannot medically recommend what she did, I must acknowledge that it revealed something extraordinary about human capability and the nature of musical talent. For Whitney Houston herself, the Radio City Music Hall performance became both a source of pride and a reminder of the cost of her choices. In one of her final interviews before her death in 2012, she was asked about that night and whether she would make the same decision again. Her answer revealed the complicated relationship she had with the event. "I'm proud that I did it," she said quietly. "I'm proud that I showed up when everything in me wanted to run away. But I also know that I only had to make that choice because of the ways I had been destroying myself. The ear infection was a symptom of a larger problem. If I had been taking care of my health, if I had been making better choices, I never would have been in that position. So it's both my greatest moment of courage and evidence of my greatest failures. That's complicated to live with." The story of Whitney Houston's silent performance at Radio City Music Hall is ultimately a story about the many ways we measure greatness. By traditional standards, that November night should have been a disaster. A sick performer pushing herself beyond safe limits to deliver a show she couldn't even hear. But by the measure that truly matters, the measure of human connection and emotional truth, it stands as one of the most powerful performances of her career. Whitney demonstrated that night that true artistry isn't about technical perfection or superhuman ability. It's about showing up with whatever you have, being honest about your limitations, and trusting that vulnerability can create deeper connections than polished performance. She sang without hearing for people she couldn't see responding, and in doing so created a moment of collective healing that resonated far beyond that single evening. The standing ovation that Whitney couldn't hear became more than just applause. It became a testament to the power of showing up broken, of performing despite being unable to verify your success, of trusting that emotional honesty will reach people even when technical perfection fails. For the thousands who witnessed it and the millions who learned about it afterward, Whitney's silent performance became proof that our struggles don't disqualify us from greatness. Sometimes they're exactly what makes greatness possible. In the end, Whitney Houston's night of singing without hearing taught a generation of performers and audiences alike that the most powerful music comes not from perfect execution, but from the courage to create despite every reason not to. She gave the greatest performance of her career by refusing to let impossible circumstances silence her voice, and in doing so, she created something more lasting than any hit record or commercial success. She created a moment of genuine human connection that continues to inspire anyone who has ever had to show up and perform while broken, to work despite being in pain, to create despite being unable to see the results. This incredible story reminds us that sometimes our greatest moments come not from our strengths, but from our willingness to be vulnerable about our weaknesses. Whitney Houston couldn't hear the standing ovation that night, but she trusted it was there. And that trust in the unseen connection between artist and audience is what transforms performance into art. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of times when you had to show up despite feeling broken, share it with someone who needs to hear that their struggles don't disqualify them from greatness. Let Whitney's courage inspire you to perform despite the silence, to create despite the fear, and to trust that vulnerability connects us more deeply than perfection ever could.